World War II was the most technologically intense conflict in human history. Nations spent years developing weapons that no one had ever seen before, weapons that could change the course of the war in a single afternoon. But not all of these weapons made it into the history books. Some were built and then immediately abandoned. Some were classified for decades after the war ended. And some were so strange, so dangerous, or so far ahead of their time that they seemed like science fiction. Today, 5 of the most forgotten secret weapons of World War II. Weapons that history tried to bury and almost succeeded. In 1944, Germany test flew an aircraft that looked like nothing anyone had ever seen before. It had no tail, no fuselage, and no conventional cockpit. It was essentially just a wing, a pure flying wing, with the pilot sitting inside the thin center section. The Horten Ho 229 was the first jet-powered flying wing ever built, and it was decades ahead of its time. It could fly at 600 miles per hour, faster than almost any fighter in the sky. And its shape made it almost invisible on radar, decades before stealth technology was supposed to exist. The Ho 229 was designed by the Horten brothers, 2 German aircraft designers who had been working on flying wing concepts since the 1930s. They believed that the flying wing was the most aerodynamically perfect shape for an aircraft, and they were right. The Ho 229 could outfly and outmaneuver almost any aircraft in the sky. It could climb faster, turn tighter, and fly further than anything the Allies had. But the Ho 229 came too late and in too small numbers to change the course of the war. Germany was already losing by the time it entered testing. Only 2 prototypes were ever built, and both were captured by the Americans before they could be fully evaluated. The Americans took one prototype back to the United States, where it sat in a warehouse for decades. When engineers finally examined it in the 1980s, they discovered that its radar-absorbing wood construction was remarkably similar to the stealth materials used on the B-2 Spirit bomber, an aircraft that was built more than 40 years later. The Horten Ho 229 was not just ahead of its time. It was a secret weapon that the world was not ready to understand. In December 1944, the United States Army Air Forces deployed a secret weapon against Japanese targets in the Pacific. It was called the BAT, and it was an autonomous radar-guided bomb that carried a 1,000-pound warhead. The BAT did not need a pilot. It did not need a target designator on the ground. It flew itself, using a primitive radar system to detect and home in on ships below. It was one of the first guided weapons ever used in combat, and it was terrifyingly effective. The BAT story is one of the most remarkable forgotten chapters of World War II. The idea came from a U.S. Navy officer named Dr. Frank McCune, who believed that bats could be trained to carry small incendiary bombs and release them over Japanese cities. The idea was not as crazy as it sounds. Bats can carry up to half their body weight in flight, and millions of them roost in caves near the American bases in the Pacific. The project was called Project X-Ray, and it nearly worked. But the problem was logistics. Training bats was slow and unpredictable. Nobody could guarantee that a bat would release its bomb over the right target, or at the right altitude, or at all. The project was eventually cancelled and replaced by the Azon rocket, a simple wire-guided rocket that could be aimed at specific targets. But the bat's radar guidance system was revolutionary. It was the direct ancestor of the modern guided bomb, and every smart weapon in use today can trace its lineage back to the little radar-guided bat that flew over the Pacific in 1944. In the final months of World War II, Germany was desperate. Its airfields were being bombed. Its fuel supplies were nearly gone. Its pilots were running out of training and running out of aircraft. So German engineers designed a weapon that could be built by anyone, launched from anywhere, and used against the Allied bomber formations that were devastating German cities. It was called the Bachhemba 349 Natter, and it was one of the strangest aircraft ever built. The Natter was a rocket-powered interceptor that was launched vertically, like a surface-to-air missile. It carried a pilot, but the pilot was not expected to survive. After the pilot climbed aboard, the Natter would be launched up into the sky on a booster rocket. Once it reached altitude, the pilot would fire its unguided rockets at the Allied bomber formation, then detach the cockpit and glide back to Earth under a parachute. The pilot would survive. The Natter would not. The Natter was built from wood and plywood, materials that were in short supply in Germany by 1945. It was designed to be so simple that anyone could build it in a few weeks. It had no landing gear, no complex navigation system, and no armament beyond its rocket payload. It was meant to be used once and thrown away. More than 200 were built in the final months of the war, but only a handful were ever launched in combat. Most were captured by Allied forces before they could be used. The natter represents the desperation of a dying nation, but it also represents something else. It was one of the first examples of vertical launch aircraft, a concept that would not be revived until the space age. It was an early attempt at what we now call a reusable launch vehicle, a vehicle that could take off vertically, deliver its payload, and return to Earth. The engineers who designed the natter were visionaries, even if their vision was twisted by the desperation of war. In 1943, the German Navy built a small coastal submarine that it called the Motor Torpedo Boat, or MTB. But the Galno was unlike any submarine that had come before. It was a hybrid, part submarine and part motor torpedo boat, designed to operate in the shallow waters of the English Channel where larger submarines could not go. It could submerge to attack Allied shipping, then surface to run away from depth charges at high speed on its surface engines. The Galno was built in response to a specific problem. The English Channel was one of the most heavily defended bodies of water in the world. Allied aircraft patrolled it constantly. Allied destroyers hunted German submarines day and night. German submarines that tried to operate in the channel were routinely sunk before they could reach their operating areas. The Galno was supposed to solve this problem by being fast enough to outrun anything that hunted it and small enough to hide in the shallowest coves and inlets along the coast. The Galno was armed with 2 torpedo tubes and a small deck gun. It carried a crew of about a dozen men. It could stay submerged for up to 24 hours, then surface and make 25 knots on its diesel engines. But the technology was too fragile for combat. The dual-capability machinery required constant maintenance that was impossible to perform at sea. The boats broke down constantly. Most were decommissioned within a year of their launch. Only a handful were ever used in combat, and none of them scored any significant successes. The Galno was forgotten almost immediately after the war. But it was not a failure of imagination. It was a failure of engineering. The idea was sound, the technology was not. Today, the lessons of the Galno inform the design of hybrid littoral vessels that navies around the world are still building. In 1943, the British Admiralty deployed a secret weapon against German U-boats that was so unusual that its existence remained classified for more than 30 years after the war ended. It was called the Pounce, and it was a modified version of the Lee light, a powerful radar-directed searchlight that was used to illuminate U-boats on the surface at night so that aircraft could attack them. The Pounce was different. It was not a searchlight. It was an acoustic device, essentially a giant underwater speaker that broadcast a specific frequency of sound designed to panic U-boat crews and make them dive. When a British aircraft detected a U-boat on the surface, it would fly over the submarine and broadcast the Pounce signal. The crew, hearing the strange noise inside the submarine, would believe that their boat was being attacked by a new type of acoustic torpedo. They would dive immediately, often surfacing in exactly the position where the British aircraft wanted them. The Pounce worked because U-boat crews were terrified of new weapons. The Germans had developed acoustic torpedoes that could home in on the sound of a ship's propellers, and Allied crews feared them equally. The Pounce exploited that fear, using the Germans' own terror against them. By the time the Germans realized the Pounce was a bluff, dozens of their U-boats had been sunk or damaged as a direct result of the panic it caused. The Pounce remained classified until 1977, when the British government finally admitted its existence. By then, the technology had been superseded by newer and more effective anti-submarine weapons. But for a few years in the middle of World War II, a simple broadcast of sound was enough to send the most feared submarine crews in the world into a panic. 5 secret weapons. 5 forgotten chapters of World War II. The flying wing that was 40 years ahead of its time. The bat that was the ancestor of every smart bomb. The piloted rocket that was designed to be thrown away. The hybrid submarine that was too fragile for the war it was built for. And the acoustic bluff that made U-boat crews dive in panic. These weapons did not win the war. Most of them barely made it into combat at all. But they tell us something important about the nature of wartime technology. The desperate drive to build something new, something different, something that no one has ever seen before. They tell us about the engineers and scientists who worked in secret, sometimes for years, to build weapons that might change everything. And they tell us that sometimes, the weapons that change everything are not the ones that work. They are the ones that nobody remembers. If you want more forgotten stories from history's most secret weapons programs, hit subscribe. And drop a comment below, which of these 5 secret weapons do you think was the most remarkable? I'll see you in the next one.